If you have your Bibles, I encourage you to open up to Genesis chapter 40. Genesis chapter 40, that's where we're going to begin this evening. We're going to spend quite a bit of our time just reading and making some observations on the text. You'll get a small break from the dysfunction that we've seen for the past couple of weeks that we've gone through this, but you don't have to worry too much. The dysfunction of Jacob's family comes back pretty soon, but not to the same degree. As we're going through these chapters, take specific note of Joseph. We ended off last week talking about how Joseph acted in obedience, so he was in a high state, in a good way off with his father, and then he's sold into slavery, and he's in this bad way off, and he's raised up to this position of prominence under the house of Potiphar, and then he's thrown in jail. And yet through all of this, Joseph continued to be obedient. And as we begin in chapter 40, we begin with Joseph being thrown. He's already been thrown in prison, and he's going to interpret the dreams of two prisoners. Genesis chapter 40, verse 1, it says, "Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against the Lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them, and they continued for some time in custody." I'm not entirely sure what these two did, but it's got to be something pretty drastic, some sort of drastic mistake that they would be thrown into prison, but not killed. So for some reason, these two men are thrown into prison, and it notes that they continued there for some time. And so they would have lived there. They would have been in fellowship to some degree with one another as they were in this prison. But something odd happens one evening. Verse 5, "One night they both dreamed. The cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled." So something's going on in their head. They realize these dreams aren't normal. There's something off with them. And so Joseph is seeing this. He asked them about this. Verse 7, "So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, 'Why are your faces downcast today?' And he said to him, 'We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them.' Joseph said to them, 'Do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me.'" At this point in the story, we know that Joseph was one who had his own dreams, and the meaning of the dreams were quite evident to those whom he told, that being his brothers for the first dream, and then his brothers and his father for the second dream, being quite evident that he would rule over them, that being the interpretation. And yet here now you have these two having these dreams, and Joseph says, isn't God the one who can interpret them? Showing that Joseph is still a man of faith. He's still clinging to God. He's still trusting in him. And so he says, "Please tell them to me." So chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossom shot forth, and clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Then Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office. And you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you. And please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." And so Joseph gives the interpretation to the cupbearer, and it's one that fares well with him. You're going to be restored in 3 days to your position. And now, if I was the chief baker and I heard this, I think I would be rather excited. At this point, the two have probably conversed with each other about their dreams and saw some similarities between the two, considering that they were together and they were both troubled about the dreams that they had had. And so if I was the chief baker, I think I'd start to get a little bit excited. Well, if his was good, mine ought to fare well. And we see this in verse 16, when the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable. When he saw that, well, the thing's going to go well with the cupbearer, it's most certainly going to go well for me then. He said to Joseph, I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head. And in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating out of the basket on my head. And Joseph answered and said, this is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head. So far, so good, except there's 2 more words. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you. Not so much the same pleasant, favorable outcome as the cupbearer. And so Joseph gives these interpretations to them, and perhaps they believed them, perhaps they didn't. We're not told what happens over these next 3 days, but what we're told in verse 20, on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, a special day for Pharaoh. He made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. How did he lift up their heads? Well, he restored the chief cupbearer to his position and placed the cup of Pharaoh in his hand. But he hanged the chief baker as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Joseph had one request of the chief cupbearer, and that is, remember me. He says, only remember me when it is well with you. And please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh so as to get me out of this house. He's saying, I'm here wrongfully. I was sold into slavery wrongfully, and I was thrown into this pit wrongfully, though I had done no wrong. And so he asked them, please remember me and mention me to Pharaoh. And in this case, Joseph would have been a very great addition to the house of Pharaoh because he just told and gave the interpretation for 2 dreams, which in those days, especially in pagan nations like Egypt, having somebody who could interpret dreams was very prized. You would want them near. And yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. There's a couple of directions that we can go with this. The one possibility, when it says he did not remember Joseph but forgot him, there can be an act of willingness to this, that he didn't call Joseph to mind in order to bring him up before Pharaoh. As in, I just got my place back, and I don't want to start rocking the boat by going to Pharaoh and making these requests to have him brought out of, it may not go well with me. I may end back up in the pits, or it might be like my fellow worker, the chief baker. And so some commentators will go the direction to say that when it says he did not remember Joseph but forgot him, it's more this implication that it was a willingness on his part to just not speak up. I lean the other direction, though, that the chief cupbearer not remembering Joseph but forgetting him is what you could call divine forgetfulness upon a person. We see this in a number of occasions throughout Scripture where something that somebody should remember or somebody that they should recognize, they all of a sudden just don't. and it just seems odd that why don't you recognize this? Why don't you remember this? It seems so out of place that this great thing happened to you, and yet you don't remember it. And with how important Joseph could have been to Pharaoh in that position, I think that the chief cupbearer forgetting Joseph, not remembering him, is an act of God, saying, I'm just not going to bring it up in your mind. Why? Because God has a purpose for Joseph in the prison at this point. It's not Joseph's time to come out of the prison. He is to remain there for a little while longer. He's already been there for a time. But we get the sense of this as well with verse 1 of chapter 41, when it says, after 2 whole years. So Joseph's already been in prison for a period of time, and then 2 years later, after 2 years later, then Pharaoh has this dream. And so, for the cupbearer to not remember but to forget, I believe that it's as a result of God causing this forgetfulness upon him, so that God can work through Joseph in this situation, because it's not time for Joseph to leave the pit yet. Chapter 41, verse 1. After 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed that he was standing by the Nile. And behold, there came up out of the Nile 7 cows, attractive and plump, and they were fed in the reed grass. And behold, 7 other cows, ugly and thin, came out of the Nile after them, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the Nile. It describes 2 sets of cows here, and in the Hebrew, it's using excessive language to describe them. Like, these are the best of the best, and these are the worst of the worst. You've never seen cows this good, and you've never seen cows this bad. Verse 4. And the ugly, thin cows ate the 7 attractive, plump cows, and Pharaoh awoke. That's got to be one strange dream. You have huge, massive cows, the ones that you would have as a prized possession for your feast because of how big they are, and then you have just these ones that you don't ever want to see them again. They're just that bad. And then they eat the big ones. What a strange dream. And Pharaoh awoke. Verse 5, and he fell asleep. And he dreamed a second time, and behold, 7 ears of grain, plump and good, were growing on one stalk. And behold, after them sprouted 7 ears, thin and blighted by the east wind. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 plump, full ears, and Pharaoh awoke, and behold, it was a dream. So if the first dream wasn't strange enough, this dream was far more strange. How do you have ears of wheat eating other ears of wheat? It's a very strange dream, and the numbers are the same. The descriptions, though different wording, are essentially the same. The best of the best, the worst of the worst of the worst eating the best of the best, and then Pharaoh awakens. Verse 8, so in the morning his spirit was troubled. And he sent and he called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was none who could interpret them to Pharaoh. This is problematic for Pharaoh, because he's just had not one dream, but 2 dreams that are very much the same. And so it's not just one dream that would make him unsettled, but when he has a second dream that is similar enough to the first dream, that would really stir up his spirits, especially in this culture, because they would have a recognition within that this is likely prophetic of some grave importance that I must know its interpretation. And so he calls to all these magicians and all these wise men, interpret it for me, and they can't. Verse 9, then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, I remember my offenses today. So after 2 years, he's then, I forgot. And I did a little bit of an oopsie, if you will. I remember my offenses today. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants that put me and the chief baker in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, we dreamed on the same night, he and I, each having a dream with its own interpretation. A young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. when we told him, he interpreted our dreams to us, giving an interpretation to each man according to his dream. And as he interpreted to us, so it came about. I was restored to my office, and the baker was hanged." And so the chief bearer, cupbearer, all just comes back to him, and he says, "I know somebody who can interpret your dreams. He's in that pit, hopefully still, after these 2 years." And then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they quickly brought him out of the pit. And when he had shaved himself and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I have had a dream, and there's no one who can interpret it. I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, you can interpret it." Joseph answered Pharaoh, "It is not in me." Now, if Joseph gave any sort of pause there, I think the cupbearer would have probably died inside quite a lot. But Joseph doesn't stop there. "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer, meaning that the outcome of this dream, or what the dream will speak of in the end, will be something that will be a blessing to Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Behold, in my dream I was standing on the banks of the Nile. 7 cows, plump and attractive, came out of the Nile and fed in the reed grass. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and thin, such as I have never seen in all the land of Egypt. And the thin cows ate up the first 7 plump cows, but when they had eaten them, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were still as ugly as the beginning. Then I awoke." And so now we get a few little extra details based on Pharaoh's perspective of his dream. Verse 22, "I also saw in my dream 7 ears growing on one stalk, full and good. 7 ears, withered, thinned, and blighted by the east wind, sprouted after them. And the thin ears swallowed up the 7 good ears. I told it to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, 'The dreams of Pharaoh are one.'" The same dream. You dream 2 parallel things. There are different descriptions within them of different objects, but they are the same dream. With the cupbearer and the baker, there was maybe the presumption they were the same, but they weren't. When you go back to Joseph's dreams were the same. And so he tells Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. And God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and ugly cows that came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears, blighted by the east wind, are also 7 years of famine. It is as I told Pharaoh. God has shown to Pharaoh what he is about to do. There will come 7 years of plenty throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them there will arise 7 years of famine, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. The famine will consume the land, and the plenty will be unknown in the land by reason of the famine that will follow, for it will be very severe. And the doubling of Pharaoh's dream means that the thing is fixed by God, and God will shortly bring it about. And so Joseph interprets the dreams to Pharaoh, and he says, first are going to come 7 years of plenty. They're going to be so plentiful, it's not like something you've ever seen before, but following that, there's going to be 7 years of famine so devastating that you will not even be able to remember that there were 7 good years. Now, there's this dream, and what's going to happen to Egypt is very important because this is basically unheard of. In the past, in Genesis, we've seen a few famines taking place. And where's the place to go during these famines? Egypt. Egypt is always a desire. Abram goes there on the one occasion. He doesn't go there the second time. He goes to a place a little bit further up north. When there's a third famine in the land, Isaac is told, don't go down to Egypt, meaning Egypt is a place that isn't suffering from this famine. But Isaac then goes up north to the same area as his father did, to Abimelech. Egypt is this place that doesn't really have a struggle with famines, because in Egypt you have the Nile River. The Nile River is connected to the sea on the west, that being the Mediterranean. And every year, the Nile floods over into the land and fertilizes the ground. And so something that was basically unheard of for Egypt was famine. Because as long as you were by the banks of the Nile, you could always have a good produce, even when there was famine elsewhere. It was a place known for its fruitfulness, that you'd be able to survive there during a famine. And so for Joseph to describe 7 years of plenty, well, okay, that's not crazy. That wouldn't be unheard of. But then to describe 7 years of famine means that something drastic is going to happen that would prevent the land from being able to bear fruit. That would prevent it from being able to have grain, to have them to be able to survive. And what Joseph is describing here is that the famine is going to be so severe that you're all going to die if you don't do something about it. And so then the question arises, because Joseph says, you dreamed this twice. And that shows that this is an event that's been ordained by God to take place, and it's going to happen very quickly. And so the question is, well, are they going to listen? Are they going to believe Joseph? Because if they're going off their past experience, famine, no, that's not going to happen to us. Or are they going to believe this word? Verse 33, it says, now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh proceed to appoint overseers over the land and take 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt during the 7 plentiful years, and let them gather all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh for food in the cities, and let them keep it. The food shall be a reserve for the land against the 7 years of famine that are to occur in the land of Egypt, so that the land may not perish through the famine. Joseph gives him the solution to survive these 7 years. Verse 37, this proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. It wasn't we don't believe you because we don't know what a famine is. We don't know the effects of it. But it pleased Pharaoh and his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this, in whom is the Spirit of God? And Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house. All my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regard to the throne will I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain around his neck. And he made him ride in his 2nd chariot, and they called out before him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no one shall lift up hand or foot in all of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphath-Paneah. And he gave him in marriage to Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly. And he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it, and Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. What Joseph interpreted for Pharaoh pleased Pharaoh, so much so Pharaoh says that there's nobody quite as wise or discerning as you. There's nobody that measures up to your discernment because God is working in you. And so Pharaoh sets Joseph over everything but the throne itself. It sounds very familiar to what happened a couple chapters earlier when Potiphar had set Joseph over all of his house, and Potiphar had no concern about anything except what he was going to eat. We see a very similar thing with Pharaoh here, where Pharaoh puts Joseph over everything. And as Joseph begins to rule over these 7 years, he begins to store up all of this, and it says Joseph stored up grain in great abundance like the sand of the sea until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. The same imagery is used to speak of how the Israelites will one day be like the sand of the sea, so much that they cannot be counted for a number. And yet Joseph is separate from his family. He's been separate for a long time. When he enters Pharaoh's house, he's 30 years old. That means 13 years have passed since he was sold as a slave. He was 17 when we first read about him, when his brothers sold him. He worked in the house of Potiphar for a while, then he worked in the prison for a while, and then interpreted the dreams, and then 2 years after that, and now we arrive to Joseph being 30. 6 years pass. By the time we get to verse 50, where it says, before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphera, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of his firstborn Manasseh, for, he said, God has caused me to forget all my hardships and all my father's house. So he names the son Manasseh, meaning God has caused me to forget. And specifically, he's saying my hardships in my father's house, meaning he has caused me to forget, to not hold on to these feelings, if you will, of ill against my family and against my brothers. He's caused me to forget that, and now I am here, and this is where I am called to be. In the name of the second, he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Ephraim meaning fruitful, or more accurately, double fruitful. Because Joseph recognizes that even though he has been afflicted for these many years in this land, now with the role that he is in, God has made him fruitful and even doubly fruitful of what he once was under the house of Potiphar. Verse 53, the 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph said. There was famine in all the lands. All the lands. But in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Joseph for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. What he says to you, do. So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was very severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. All the land. Over all the earth. I mean, this famine is something unheard of. It's not just a localized famine in certain areas, but this famine is widespread. Which begs the question, if this famine is so widespread that all the lands are coming, what about Joseph's family? Aren't they going to be struggling with the famine too? And that's what begins our next chapter. When Jacob learned that there was grain for sale in Egypt, he said to his sons, why do you look to one another? He said, "Behold, I have heard that there is grain for sale in Egypt. Go down and buy grain for us there, that we may live and not die." And so Jacob recognizes this famine is so severe that if we don't do something and get more food, we're dead. We're not going to survive this. So he sends his sons. So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain in Egypt. 10. But how many brothers are there? There's 11, meaning one didn't go. Verse 4, but Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's brother, with his brothers, for he feared that harm might happen to him. Thus the sons of Israel came to buy among the others who came, for the famine was in the land of Canaan. Now Joseph was governor over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. Doesn't that sound familiar? It was only like it was 21 years ago that a certain 17-year-old said to his brothers, "Hey, I had these two dreams in which you were going to bow down before me." And now they come before him 20 years later. So imagine the last time you've seen your brother was when he was 17. And we can't picture it with today's youth and how they would have looked. At 17, Joseph would have likely had a full beard. It wouldn't have been uncommon for them in that land. His skin likely would have been worn down a little bit from the sun. He wouldn't have been living inside all the time, as we often do. And in that area of the world, the sun beats a little bit harsher than it does in our cold winters here in Canada. But at the same time, when you go from 17 to 27, or to 37, or 38, and now Joseph is going to be clean shaven because he's in Egypt, he's going to look very different. And so they come before him, not likely, we do know they do not recognize him, and they bow before him, and their faces are on the ground. And Joseph said, 20 years earlier, I dreamed this dream, and this is what's going to happen. And they said to him, "Are you going to rule over us? Is this something you're going to do?" Scoffing at him, mocking him, and yet they came and bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. Verse 7, Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them. Oh, they don't know who he is, but he knows exactly who they are. There's 10 of them seeing one of him who would look very different, but there's one of him seeing 10 of them whom are older than him, several of them being much older than him, and so he has a greater chance of recognizing them while they would have no clue who he is and would think, well, he's probably maybe an Egyptian or maybe just one of Pharaoh's slaves who has become a high position of prominence, but not our brother Joseph. No way. Probably don't have any of that in their mind. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke harshly to them. He spoke harshly to them, and he said, "Where do you come from? Where do you come from?" Questioning at them, probing them, and doing it in a way that's obviously going to make them very, very uncomfortable. We've seen before this aspect of harshness, that one speaks harshly to another, that person fleeing before the person that spoke harshly, but having to return to them for salvation. You see this with Sarah and Hagar, where Sarah speaks harshly to Hagar. Hagar runs away, but God tells her, you need to go back there. And there's this aspect of salvation pictured in that chapter. And here you have very similar language where he says, "Where do you come from?" And they said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." And Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. And Joseph remembered the dreams that he had dreamed of them and said to them, "You are spies. You have come to see the nakedness of the land." He said to him, "No, my lord, your servants have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants have never been spies." Well, the phrase, "your servants have never been spies," is likely true, maybe, perhaps not. We are honest men. Are his brothers honest men? Maybe in the past 20 years, they have been honest men. But 21 years ago, were they honest men when they sold their brother? And can they say that they are honest men when they have been selling this lie to their father for the past 20 years that their brother died by the hands of a wild animal instead of them selling him for a little bit of profit, because it was no profit to them to kill him? And so they plead their innocence and their integrity. Verse 12, "And he said to them, 'No, it is the nakedness of the land that you have come to see.' And they said, 'We are your servants. We, your servants, are 12 brothers, the son of one man in the land of Canaan, and behold, the youngest is this day with our father, and one is no more.' But Joseph said to them, 'It is as I said to you, you are spies. By this you shall be tested. By the life of Pharaoh you shall not go from this place until your youngest brother comes here. Send one of you and let him bring your brother while you remain confined, that your words may be tested, whether there is truth in you. Or else, by the life of Pharaoh, surely you are spies.' And he put them all together in custody for 3 days." So Joseph doesn't back down. They say, "We're not spies." He says, "You're spies." "We're not spies." "You are spies. And I'm going to test you to prove it. You got to go and get Benjamin. But only one of you is going to go. The rest of you, you're going to remain here in custody for that time." But starting off, he puts them all in custody for 3 days. Why is it that Joseph wants them to bring Benjamin? Well, I'm guessing, and this is the common conclusion with this, that Joseph is concerned about Benjamin. The last interaction that he had with his brothers was not a very pleasant one. They had thrown him into a pit. They had lunch while he was crying out from the pit for help, weeping and begging of them. They wouldn't listen to him. They're planning on killing him, but when that wouldn't give them any sort of physical gain, they just sold him. This is the last experience that Joseph has with his brothers. But then there's Benjamin, the youngest of all of them, who is his brother from his father and his mother, and the only one. And it stands to reason that if Joseph was the favorite child because he was the child of both Rachel and the child of Jacob in his old age, that after Joseph is dead, by the presumption of his father, that Benjamin would then take that place, and perhaps to an even greater strength than with Joseph. And that's exactly what we see. That Jacob does not want to let Benjamin leave his side because he's concerned about what's going to happen. Benjamin at this time, he's a full-grown man. It's been 20 years for Joseph. It means it's also been 20 years for Benjamin. So whatever Benjamin's age was, which we don't know, we know that he's at least over 20 years old. And so it stands to reason that Joseph is wondering, did they do something to Benjamin as well? They say, we're honest men. We're men of integrity. But yet Benjamin is not there among them. Is this because he's actually at home, or is this because they have killed him? And so he puts them to the test. Verse 18, "On the third day Joseph said to them, 'Do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, let one of your brothers remain confined where you are in custody.'" So it's not all of you are going to remain and one's going to go. After the 3 days, and Joseph is drilling into them a little bit of fear, he says, one of you is going to remain, and the rest may go. And let the rest go and carry grain for the famine of your households, and bring your youngest brother to me, so your words will be verified, and you shall not die. And they did so. And they said to one another, in truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us, and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us. They are recognizing that we did a pretty horrible thing. He begged us. He was distressed to his very soul, and yet we didn't hear him, but rather just sat and had lunch. But one stands out among them, verse 22, and Reuben answered them, did I not tell you to not sin against the boy? But you did not listen, so now there comes a reckoning for his blood. Now, they're saying this in their own language. They're not saying it in Egyptian. But the narrator here gives us a very helpful comment. Verse 23, they did not know that Joseph understood them, for there was an interpreter between them. So they're whispering, they're having this conversation, and there's this interpreter, but it's giving this impression. The interpreter is not relaying this back onto Joseph. It's them having this conversation between themselves about what has happened with the one who is no more, that being Joseph. But Joseph understands everything that they're saying. And this is the first time that he has heard that Reuben actually stood up for him. Because before that, he was way off in the distance. And then they throw him into the pit, Reuben leaves, and then they sell him. And so he doesn't know that Reuben didn't want him sold. And so he hears this, and he hears that they feel this guilt and this distress, and they say, this has come upon us because of the evil that we have done. And Joseph responds, verse 24, then he turned away from them and wept. And he returned to them and spoke to them. He took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. Why Simeon? He's the secondborn. Why not Reuben? Well, out of all the brothers, Reuben is the only one that would, you could say, deserve to not be put in prison, because he was the only one who mostly didn't have a hand in this. Although his absence can bring that into question. But Joseph weeps, and he's sorrowed over what has taken place. Because at the end of the day, they are still his brothers. And it hurts him to see them grieving over what they have done and this whole situation that they are in. And yet he knows he still needs to test them to see, are they honest men? Verse 25, and Joseph gave orders to fill their bags with grain and to replace every man's money in his sack and to give them provisions for the journey. This was done for them. Then they loaded their donkeys with their grain and departed. And as one of them opened his sack to give his donkey fodder at the lodging place, he saw the money in the mouth of his sack. He said to his brothers, my money has been put back. Here it is in the mouth of my sack. At this, their hearts failed them. And they turned trembling to one another, saying, what is this that God has done to us? They recognize money should not be here, and it is here. And the obvious conclusion that's going to happen is this man that spoke very harshly to us will think that we stole it from him when we left. Now, how are we ever going to be able to go back before him? And so their hearts fail, and they tremble because their money has returned. And they know, well, we didn't take it. And so what else could it be than the hand of God who has done this to us? Verse 29, when they came to Jacob their father in the land of Canaan, they told him all that happened to them, saying, the man, the Lord of the land, spoke harshly to us and took us to be spies of the land. We said to him, we are honest men. We have never been spies. We are 12 brothers, sons of our father. One is no more, and the youngest is this day with our father in Canaan. Then the man, the Lord of the land, said to us, By this I shall know that you are honest men. Leave one of your brothers with me and take grain for the famine of your households and go your way. Bring your youngest brother to me, then I shall know that you are not spies but honest men, and I will deliver your brother to you, that you may trade in the land. As they emptied their sacks, behold, every man's bundle of money was in his sack. And when they and their father saw the bundles of money, they were afraid. And Jacob their father said to them, You have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you would take Benjamin. All this has come against me. Not only is Jacob afraid, but he is also grieving. Still grieving over the loss of Joseph. Now grieving over the loss that he believes that Simeon has had. Simeon is now dead, and if he's in jail and you have come here and the money's in here, most certainly he's killed him already. And now you want to take Benjamin, the one that he wouldn't let go in the first place. You want to take him to the land. Then Reuben said to his father, Kill my 2 sons if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my hands, and I will bring him back to you. But he said, My son shall not go with you, for his brother is dead, and he is the only one left. If harm should happen to him on the journey that you are to make, you would bring down my gray hairs with sorrow to Sheol. Benjamin's all that I got. And in this very sentence, he's saying the exact same things that he said 20 years prior. This is my favorite son. This is the son who now he shall not leave my side. Even if it means that Simeon must die, even if it means that we cannot have grain anymore, he will not go with you. And Reuben tries to intercede. Reuben being the firstborn, he says, if I can't come back and bring him back, you can kill my sons. And Reuben tries to intercede and say, we need to bring him back. But Jacob will have none of this. Jacob refuses to listen to Reuben. This is important as it continues. Now the famine was severe in the land. And when they had eaten the grain that they had bought from Egypt, their father said to them, Go again, buy us a little food. But Judah said to him, Who said to him? Why is it Judah talking? Why isn't it Reuben? But Judah said to him, The man solemnly warned us, saying, You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. If you will send our brother with us, we will go down and buy you food. But if you will not send him, we will not go down. For the man said to us, You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. Israel said, Why did you treat me so badly, as to tell the man that you had another brother? They replied, The man questioned us carefully about ourselves and about our kindred, saying, Is your father still alive? Do you have another brother? What we told him was the answer to these questions. Could we in any way know that he would say, Bring your brother down? And Judah said to Israel his father, Send the boy with me. Again, Judah says, it's not Reuben, Judah said to Israel his father, Send the boy with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and you and also our little ones. I will be a pledge of his safety. From my hand you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever. If we had not delayed, we would have now returned twice. So a lengthy period of time has passed that they had been there. They could have gone there and back, there and back. And so time has passed. Simeon is still there in prison. But here you have Judah interceding. Verse 11, then their father Israel said to them, if it must be so, then do this. Take some of the choice fruits of the land in your bags and carry a present down to the man, a little balm and a little honey, gum, myrrh, pistachio nuts, and almonds. Take double the money with you. Carry back with you the money that was returned in the mouth of your sacks. Perhaps it was an oversight. Take also your brother and arise, go again to the man. May El Shaddai, may God Almighty grant you mercy before the man, and may he send you back your other brother and Benjamin. But as for me, if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. And so Jacob says yes to Judah. He doesn't say yes to Reuben. This raises questions as to why. And as the text continues and you get into chapters 48 and 49, the questions arise even more because Reuben is skipped over for the blessing of the firstborn. And we see that it's because Reuben went in to his father's bed and slept with his father's concubine. A horrible thing to do, something that in that culture was perceived as evil. And in the nations around, it's just something that you don't do. And yet Reuben does this, and ever since that, you see this rift between Reuben as the firstborn and Jacob. And you begin to see the first glimpses of it here with Judah being the one that Jacob trusts with the right of the firstborn to watch over his brother. He doesn't trust Reuben. He doesn't trust Simeon, who isn't there, so it doesn't matter. And he also doesn't trust Levi. We'll get to that when we get to the blessings, but he trusts Judah and he gives him to Judah. And so in this way, we get the glimpse of Judah being the one who is perceived as the firstborn, because the other three have been rejected from that. And so he gives him Benjamin. Verse 15, so the men took this present, and they took double the money with them and Benjamin. They arose and went down to Egypt and stood before Joseph. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the steward of his house, bring the men into the house and slaughter an animal and make ready, for the men are to dine with me at noon. The man did as Joseph told him and brought the men to Joseph's house. And the men were afraid because they were brought to Joseph's house, and they said, it is because of the money, which was replaced in our sacks the first time that we brought in, so that he may assault us and fall upon us and make us servants and seize our donkeys. So they went up to the steward of Joseph's house and spoke with him at the door of the house and said, well, my lord, we came down the first time to buy food, and when we came to the lodging place, we opened our sacks, and there was each man's money in the mouth of his sack, our money in full weight. So we have brought it with us again. And we have brought other money down with us to buy food. We do not know who put the money in our sacks. He said, peace to you. Do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father has put treasure in your sack. He has put treasure in your sacks for you. I received your money. Then he brought Simeon out to them. And when the man had brought the men into Joseph's house and given them water, and they had washed their feet, and when he had given their donkeys fodder, they prepared the presents for Joseph's coming at noon, for they heard that they should eat bread there. And Joseph came home. They brought into the house to him the presents that they had with them, and bowed down to him to the ground. They're bowing down yet again. Something they said they would never do, but here they are doing it. And he inquired about their welfare and said, is your father well? The man of whom you spoke, is he still alive? They said, your servant, our father, is well. He is alive. So they bowed down before him, and now what do they describe their father as? Joseph's servant. They say he is alive, and they bowed their heads and prostrated themselves in other words, this is basically just repetition to say they bowed down, and they bowed down very low. Verse 29, and he lifted up his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, "Is this your youngest brother, of whom you spoke to me? God be gracious to you, my son." Then Joseph hurried out, for his compassion grew warm for his brothers, and he sought a place to weep. And he entered his chamber, and he wept there. Then he washed his face and came out, and controlling himself, he said, "Serve the food." And they served him by himself, and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat with Hebrews, for that is an abomination to Egyptians. This becomes important later that shepherds, people who watch over sheep, were considered to be abominations to Egyptians. So much so they would not eat with them. So much so that many years later they would enslave them. Verse 33, and they sat down before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth. And the men looked at one another in amazement. Portions were taken to them from Joseph's table, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as any of theirs, and they drank and were merry with him. There's some strange things going on here. Why does this man have such a fascination with their father, such concern over him? Why does he have such fascination and concern with Benjamin? So much so that he gives them 5 times as much food as the rest of them. How is it that they are ordered by age? There's 11 of them. This isn't something that you just get by chance, especially with the age of them. You'd be guessing as to, is this one older, is this one older? Especially when likely most of them are within a year or 2 apart. In different sections of that, it'd be really, really difficult to just randomly guess and put them in order. And yet, Joseph aligns them in order, and they're amazed. What is this? What's going on? And so things aren't seemingly adding up, and there's amazement and probably some questioning going on in their mind. We're out of time for this evening. But we're going to see as it continues, Joseph tests his brothers yet again. But I find this first test that he gives them very interesting. Go and get your youngest brother. Now think about this rationally speaking. What is stopping them from just grabbing some guy who looks somewhat similar to them and bringing them to another nation who probably can't distinguish between them very well, especially when they're all scruffy and full bearded and probably quite dark from the sun? They could have just grabbed anybody who was younger than them and brought him with them. And how would he have known that this was their brother? Could have grabbed a cousin who knows the family well. Within that area, you would have known everybody well. They could have asked him whatever kinds of questions about to try and verify that he is their brother, and somebody who is not their brother could have quite easily stepped into that and given all the right answers and tricked him into believing. When I look at this test, when you think about it rationally, it's not a very good test unless Joseph knows who his brother is. They could have brought anybody, could have lied about it, but because this is Joseph, he would have known. And they're so afraid about what he might do to them that it doesn't even give the sense that this is a consideration for them. They bring Benjamin. And Joseph sees Benjamin, and he knows his father is still well and still alive, and his brothers come, and Joseph becomes compassionate for his brothers, but he doesn't let them know who he is yet. Because though they have brought Benjamin, he's still concerned. Now he knows Benjamin's alive, but the question is, why is Benjamin still alive? Have my brothers learned their lesson? And so Joseph's going to continue to test them, and he's going to continue to be harsh to them because he needs to know. Have you learned your lesson? Joseph, as we discussed last week, pictures Christ in a number of different ways. Joseph pictures Christ's betrayal, when he was betrayed by his brothers, those who should have accepted him. He was betrayed by them and sold for the wages of a slave, just like Christ. Joseph went off into this foreign land that was not his home. Joseph, while he was in this foreign land, was accused of sin he did not commit, in the very same way that Jesus came to this world and was accused of sin he did not commit, and both were condemned for their actions. Christ was crucified and died and went to the grave. Joseph is condemned, sent to prison, though not death, but in that image of him going down into the pit is a picture of descending down into Sheol. And Joseph being in this grave-like state, or as the author of Hebrews likes to say, he was as good as dead. You go down there, you don't get out of there, you go down there and you die down there. And yet what happens? Joseph is raised out of this, not to just some ordinary position, but to second in command to the most powerful one in the land. And not only that, but Pharaoh places under Joseph all authority, except the throne itself. In Christ, he died, he was buried, and he was raised. He wasn't just raised to walk around on the earth. He wasn't raised to be this servant as he had been in the land, but he was raised to the right hand of the Father, the most powerful over all, and the Father has given to him authority over everything, except the throne itself. So Joseph pictures Christ in this way, but he also pictures Christ as a mediator. And he pictures in a way how God uses discipline to work in our lives, to transform us to be more like Christ. Now, Joseph, he's not omnipotent. He doesn't know what's going on in his brothers' hearts. He doesn't know if they have changed, but he does things to strengthen them. He does things to push them along in their journey. And as they're seeing, it's as if they're saying, we're being punished for what we have done. And as we go through, we're going to see this aspect of forgiveness and this aspect of how Joseph loves his brothers, and he's not doing this out of hate unto them, but because he loves them. And Christ, as our mediator and the one who loves us, as our great high priest, when we act in ways that we probably shouldn't be acting, he disciplines us to set us on the right path, because he knows that we cannot stay where we're at, but we need to be transformed into his image. And so the Spirit works in us to transform us to be like him. I think the thing that amazes me most about Joseph is his compassion for his brothers, because I don't know about you, but I don't think I would be. If I was sold as a slave by my brothers, treated horribly, and then 20 years later they come before me and start begging of me, what would my reaction be? What would your reaction be? Would it be Joseph's to be compassionate to them, to weep that they are hurting, to want to see them do better, or to be off with their head. Joseph here, in his compassion, his great warmth for his brothers, how he weeps over them, also shows Christ's heart for us. That even when we don't do well, even when we struggle, even when we sin, he still has compassion for us. His compassion, his mercy doesn't grow cold. He doesn't grow angry and just cut us off and say, no more with you. But he loves us and he cherishes us and he works in us. Joseph has been very obedient in whatever situation we've seen. Was he perfect? By no means. But he was a man of faith and demonstrates great faith and will continue to do so in the coming chapters, over the coming years. And it should be a lesson to us. We ought to be faithful. And his reaction to those who have harmed him the most, being that of love and compassion, should be an example to us to have that same sort of love and compassion for others. Let's pray. Gracious Lord, I thank you for your love for us. Lord, that while we were yet sinners, you died for us. You took our place on the cross. You bore the wrath that we deserved so that we wouldn't have to. Lord, I pray that we would treasure that we would prize that every day, that we would praise you every day for that, and long to serve you well, to be a faithful people before you. And Lord, just as you have loved us, Lord, let us show love to one another, be compassionate to one another, bearing with one another, in grace and mercy and love, and building one another up. In Jesus' name, amen.